It was a critical triumph of international diplomacy, a temporary but vital truce that couldn't come a moment too soon. On Tuesday, the 26th of November, the Security Cabinet of the Middle Eastern nation of Israel approved a ceasefire agreement with its northern neighbor Lebanon, setting in motion a series of events that could, and hopefully will, bring about a permanent end to the Israel-Hezbollah war. Brokered with the help of the United States of America and going into effect in the early morning hours of the following day, the ceasefire has held as of the time of writing. Whether or not it remains stable, only Israel and Hezbollah can say. Yet this surprise diplomatic victory raises just as many questions as it does answers. How will a war that seemed as if it were intensifying just a few days prior really give way to a peace in such a hotly contested region? What will happen with the ceasefire in effect? Can hundreds of thousands of displaced Israeli and Lebanese civilians finally return to their homes? And is there any hope that this ceasefire in Lebanon might help to bring about a ceasefire in Gaza? All these questions and more deserve an answer, and in today's special episode of WarFronts, we're going to find out. Alright, before we explain the terms of this ceasefire agreement, it's important to understand at least the broad strokes of the war that this agreement is trying to end. The nation of Israel and the powerful paramilitary organization Hezbollah, based in Lebanon but backed by Iran, have traded fire across the Israel-Lebanon border since early October. At that time, Hezbollah had launched rocket attacks into Israel in solidarity and support for its fellow Iranian-backed militant group Hamas after Hamas launched the massive terror attacks of October the 7th, 2023, from the encircled Gaza Strip into Israel proper. Ever since then, Hezbollah and Israel volleyed fire back and forth across their shared border, but it was in September of 2024 when the conflict really intensified. At that time, Israel's Security Cabinet decided to add a new war aim in its ongoing war against Hamas in Gaza, specifically that Israel would return tens of thousands of displaced residents to northern Israeli territory where Hezbollah, not Hamas, had displaced them with continual rocket attacks. In the hours after that announcement, the world feared a dramatic escalation between Israel and Hezbollah, with the latter being an exponentially better armed and more powerful military threat than Hamas in Gaza ever was. But in the following days and weeks, Israel revealed the sheer depth of its military intelligence penetration of Hezbollah's operations. A pair of massive sabotage attacks using explosives planted in pages and handheld radios used by Hezbollah operatives took thousands of fighters and civilian Hezbollah members out of action. Then, a major airstrike campaign by Israel decapitated the majority of Hezbollah's leadership structure, including its longtime leader, Hassan Nasrallah, and nearly all of its military commanders. The air campaign achieved high success in dismantling Hezbollah's leadership, despite racking up high civilian casualties in the process. With the chain of command already devastated, Israel launched a limited ground invasion in southern Lebanon, clearing out Hezbollah fighters in the immediate vicinity of the Israeli border and dismantling the weapons stockpiles, tunnel networks, and other physical infrastructure that would have enabled Hezbollah ground attacks onto Israeli territory. In the grand scheme of things, Israel achieved a series of decisive victories against the Hezbollah organization over the course of its operations, but the affair was devastating for Lebanon, with over 3,500 people killed and 15,000 injured, a high proportion of them civilians, since the start of the violence in 2023. Now, most of those casualties came after Israel's intensification of hostilities in mid-September. Roughly 140 Israeli troops and civilians have been killed during that same time period, while tens of thousands in Israel and hundreds of thousands in Lebanon have been temporarily displaced. But in order to even consider a settlement to end the violence, people in both nations and around the world first had to understand what Israel meant to achieve. The goal, as Israel's military planners put it, was simple: to prevent Hezbollah from posing any danger to Israeli residents for the foreseeable future. But in practice, as Israel itself had explained many times, that would mean a comprehensive dismantling of Hezbollah and an effort to push and keep the organization's fighters north of the Litani River in accordance with UN peace terms established decades ago. In order to achieve such a thing, Israel would have had to either surge far more troops into Hezbollah, take far more territory themselves, and begin a comprehensive occupation of the land south of the Litani, or a diplomatic breakthrough would have to come quickly. And that breakthrough finally came in the days preceding Tuesday, November the 26th, where, although many details of the diplomatic effort remain hazy, we do know that the United States and other international partners were able to move both sides of the Israel-Hezbollah war toward a peace settlement. The change likely started last year after Hezbollah's new leader, Naim Qassem, made suggestions in a published video indicating that Hezbollah's terms for a ceasefire had changed. Rather than some of the more prohibitive terms that had been included in earlier discussions, Qassem's terms were quite simple. Israel would need to stop attacking Lebanon, Lebanon would need to remain a sovereign nation, and Everything else was implied to be up for debate. The video was published shortly after Iran had urged Hezbollah, its own proxy force, to consider accepting a ceasefire rather than continuing its hostilities. In a practical sense, Hezbollah had now been ground down to the point that it's low on rockets, experienced fighters, reliable decision makers, and more. The group had long been known for its contingency, structuring itself in a way where targeted Israeli attacks, deaths of its leaders, or disruption of command and control wouldn't doom the group to failure in combat. But after months of sustained campaigning, Israel appeared to have worked its way through so many dismantled Hezbollah contingency plans that even this notoriously resilient group just couldn't hold up. Meanwhile, Israeli officials have been increasingly signaling their interest in a ceasefire in Lebanon in order to repivot its attention, manpower, and priorities back to Gaza at a time when Israeli intelligence increasingly suggests that Hezbollah no longer poses an imminent threat. The Lebanese government, which has not itself been party to the war, revealed details of a proposed draft agreement with Israel calling for a 60-day truce. The country's leader expressed optimism around the prospect of a deal and indicated a broad willingness to accept potentially thorny compromise terms in order to make it happen. Picking up on the signs and signals, or perhaps responding to news they'd already received behind the scenes, the global diplomatic community did its own part, increasing discussion and pressure around a potential agreement on both sides of the Israel-Lebanon divide. And over the course of the days preceding the deal, a slow trickle of optimistic news turned into a cascade. US envoys were able to pass terms back and forth between Israel and Lebanon in private, with public indicators spilling out that they were reaching agreement in critical areas. A potentially major disruption when the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants against Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant was smoothed over between Israel, the US, and France. When Israel began to apply its own pressure on the United States to stonewall the deal, lead negotiator Amos Hochstein reportedly threatened to withdraw from the efforts entirely, meaning that Israel would lose an asset that its leadership regards as a reliable and trusted interlocutor. Israel held meetings across the weekend prior to the deal, with intelligence chiefs and ministers agreeing to move forward, while shuttle diplomacy with Lebanon ensured that Israel's battered northern neighbor would agree to changing terms as they came to light. Both sides launched a final challenge during that weekend, with Israeli airstrikes in Lebanon's capital city leaving at least 20 people dead, and with a Hezbollah attack involving over 200 rockets leaving Israeli neighborhoods in flames. But neither side's combat action deterred the other from continual engagement with the peace process. And finally, on Tuesday the 26th, Israel agreed to the terms once and for all. Lebanon's rubber stamp followed shortly afterward, mostly as a formality. At 4 a.m, local time, on Wednesday the 27th, Israel and Hezbollah entered a state of truce. Okay, so a ceasefire deal has now been hammered out between the two warring sides, but what does the ceasefire actually say? Well, the deal includes significant compromises by both sides, and with those compromises, a pathway to long-term enforcement of a buffer zone that should keep the conflict on ice for quite a while. The core of the deal is an agreement by Hezbollah to remove its fighters from southern Lebanon over the course of the next 60 days. During that time, Hezbollah's personnel will have to move both themselves and their weaponry from the area between the agreed-upon unofficial borderline that delineates Lebanon from Israel and the Litani River that we mentioned previously. From north to south, that's a distance of about 30 kilometers, 20 miles, including a stretch of land in the southeast that stretches a bit further up into Lebanese territory. Over those same 60 days, Israel will withdraw its own military personnel, weaponry, and civilians to territory south of the agreed-upon border. With the fighting forces of both sides gone from the area, the hope is for both Israel and Lebanon to begin civilian resettlements as soon as possible. Just as important as the agreement, however, is the mechanism of enforcement that will ensure that neither Israeli nor Hezbollah forces remain. This time around, that task will be handled by the Lebanese army, a dramatic improvement over Israel's withdrawal the last time it pulled out of Lebanon after fighting Hezbollah. Back then, a flimsy pro-Lebanon paramilitary was expected to keep the area free of Hezbollah fighters, but it was quickly overrun. This time, however, the Lebanese military will expand its own presence south of the Litani instead. It'll be on the Lebanese military to ensure that the military infrastructure of both the Israeli Defense Forces, or IDF, and Hezbollah are dismantled and cannot be easily re-established. Roughly 5,000 Lebanese troops will be assigned to the effort, with support from a United Nations peacekeeping force that's already active in the area called UNIFIL. That agreement by itself would largely reset the terms of UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which had been agreed at the end of the last Israel-Hezbollah war in 2006. But Resolution 1701 wasn't effective back then. And this time, France and the United States have committed to investment of their own resources to make up the gap. Officials from the United States have been clear that no combat troops of the US military will be deployed to the buffer zone directly, but that the Lebanese armed forces will receive direct support. The French military will provide much of the same. Meanwhile, Israel retains some right to respond to violations of the deal, as Prime Minister Netanyahu personally emphasized in the wake of the deal, seemingly in an attempt to get in front of the backlash coming from Israel's hard-right political wing. Said Netanyahu of the agreement, quote, "If Hezbollah violates the agreement and tries to arm itself, we will attack. If it tries to rebuild terrorist infrastructure near the border, we will attack. If it launches a rocket, if it digs a tunnel, if it brings in a truck carrying rockets, we will attack." Outgoing US President Joe Biden affirmed Netanyahu's view, quoting him here, "If Hezbollah or anyone else breaks the deal and poses a direct threat to Israel, then Israel retains the right to self-defense consistent with international law." End quote. It's not clear that this arrangement is explicitly included in the ceasefire, but may instead be a supplemental agreement reached between Israel and the US directly without Lebanon's involvement. Hopefully, the ceasefire will hold across the 60-day period for which it's currently established, and if it does, the hope amongst negotiators and other relevant diplomatic personnel is that it will evolve into a permanent agreement to keep lands south of the Litani clear and to keep the fighting forces of both sides pacified on their own territory. For the most part, it'll turn into a 2020s expression of what the 2006 UN resolution was supposed to achieve all those years ago, a better enforced, better monitored version of the same agreement that was intended to have been regulating the area the entire time. With the cover of peacekeeping forces, Israel and Lebanon will hopefully settle territorial disputes across their shared border, build a lasting framework to avoid future violence, and work toward rebuilding devastated communities on both sides. And in a political sense, both Israel and Hezbollah can claim victory to their people. Israel, of course, eviscerated the Hezbollah organization, removed its teeth and claws, and forced it into a posture where, on paper, it'll lack the ability to pose a threat to Israel. Hezbollah, by contrast, can claim that its resilience was simply too much for Israel to defeat in battle, and that rather than commit to what it knew would be a ruinous larger offensive, Israel chose to leave Lebanon and sue for peace as equals. At the time of writing, at the end of the day, Wednesday the 27th local time, the ceasefire has broadly held. Neither Hezbollah nor Israel have launched subsequent attacks against the other, and the Lebanese army and UNIFIL forces have not been obstructed in carrying out their task to prepare for the coming weeks. There have, however, been a handful of disturbances that each side has dealt with. In one case, the IDF admitted to having fired shots at vehicles that were driving toward what is referred to as a, quote, zone prohibited for movement in southern Lebanon. Per the IDF, the drivers of the vehicles chose to turn around without further escalation. In another incident that has yet to be fully explained, journalists via Lebanon's national news agency claim that 2 journalists were injured when Israeli troops opened fire on a group of clearly marked reporters and press. Meanwhile, gunshots did ring out across the southern suburbs of Lebanon's capital city, Beirut, although those gunshots are believed to have been celebratory in nature. Across Lebanon, civilians speaking to international press expressed some skepticism that the ceasefire would hold, especially in the areas where bombing had taken place in the prior days or even on the prior night. But the follow-up violence they expect to begin eventually hasn't kicked off yet. Within hours of the announcement, roads leading from Beirut were choked with traffic, cars and trucks driven by people eager to return home and see what had survived the fighting. Both Hezbollah and the political movement Amal have laid out guidelines on how these people can return to their homes, although those hoping to return to the more southerly states where IDF troops are active may face headwinds in doing so. Israel has actively discouraged these people from returning home quite yet, as the IDF's Arab media spokesman, Lieutenant Colonel Avachai Adri, explained on social media, quoting him here, "You are prohibited from moving toward the villages that the IDF has asked to be evacuated or towards the IDF forces in the area. For your safety and the safety of your family members, refrain from moving to the area. We will inform you when it is safe to return to your homes." The quote ends. The Lebanese army has expressed a similar sentiment and indicated that residents of border villages should not return. As these statements reinforce, it's important to remember that Israel does have 60 days to vacate the area, and while both Hezbollah and Israel have now shifted into a defensive posture that doesn't allow for proactive attack against each other, neither group will be able to leave fully for at least the next few weeks. On Israel's side, it's not clear when the tens of thousands of displaced northerners will be able to return to their homes. Most of them now live in hotels or temporary accommodation, far from the reach of most of Hezbollah's munitions, but their leader, Prime Minister Netanyahu, has yet to issue a return timeline at the time of writing. If Israel fears that the ceasefire may not be airtight, it could be weeks or even months until resettlement is brought up for consideration. Around the world, the ceasefire has been lauded as a triumph for peace and diplomacy, as well as a major victory for outgoing US President Biden and embattled French President Emmanuel Macron. International aid organizations signaled plans to eventually resume or step up humanitarian support in the event that the ceasefire does hold, and world nations paid special attention to the renewed hopes for an effort to establish greater stability in Lebanon, a place that's been largely regarded as a failed state for several years. In a critical show of support for the idea that the ceasefire might actually hold, both Hezbollah's major backer Iran and its larger supporters Russia and China expressed unanimously that they welcome the deal rather than intending to oppose it in any meaningful way. Iran's foreign minister even backed off from promises to retaliate against last month's Israeli airstrike, suggesting that other regional developments could render such a thing unnecessary. It's still early yet, but as of now, indications are that this ceasefire might actually hold for the long term. Look, in an ideal world, everything that happens from this moment forward will be a net positive for the region. Hezbollah will vacate the buffer zone south of the Litani, Israeli troops will return to their own territory, and both the Lebanese army and UNIFIL will prove themselves to be capable peacekeepers in a place where peacekeeping influence is badly needed. Israeli residents will go about returning to their homes with the aid of their government. Lebanese residents will continue the resettlement that appears to be already underway. Lebanon will set about reopening and rebuilding its health centers, schools, and other human infrastructure that has been devastated by Israel's campaign, while Israel will reconsolidate its forces, return exhausted reservists to civilian life, and pivot back towards its other pressing concerns, the immediate situation in Gaza and the larger threat presented by Iran. Eventually, Israel and Lebanon will hammer out their remaining disputes. All parties involved will agree on a lasting peace accord, and in this version of events, a battered regional population is able to reconcile and live happily ever after. But look, real life is rarely so neat and tidy, and already international experts have raised alarm around a number of potential pitfalls they've spotted in the current ceasefire arrangement. In one key blind spot, it's unclear that the Lebanese army is ready or able to confront Hezbollah forces directly as they patrol the land south of the Litani. The Lebanese army has already stated that it is not capable of fulfilling its obligations by itself under the deal, both because of financial constraints and shortages in manpower and equipment. The hope, at the time of writing, is that international support will make up the gap, but there are no guarantees that any such support will arrive, nor are there any guarantees that Hezbollah, even in its weakened state, couldn't pose a direct head-to-head threat in engagements of its own choosing against the Lebanese army. If skirmishes do break out, they'll have the potential to destabilize Lebanon even further, inflaming tensions between supporters of the predominantly Christian army and the Shia Muslim supporters of Hezbollah. Historically, the Lebanese military hasn't been able to rein Hezbollah in for decades, while the UNIFIL peacekeepers in the area haven't had the power to actively confront Hezbollah unless attacked directly. And underlying that problem is another one, that it's an open question whether Hezbollah will withdraw to lands north of the Litani and what that withdrawal could actually look like. Southern Lebanon is where Hezbollah support is at its strongest, where the group's fighters live, and where the group's civil administration provides social services that the Lebanese government have utterly failed in maintaining. In a practical sense, will the idea of Hezbollah withdrawal from the south mean that the group's military infrastructure, its weapons stores, and its leadership go north of the Litani and that gatherings of Hezbollah fighters take place there? Or will it mean the mass migration of the thousands of Hezbollah fighters whose lives are deeply rooted in the south? Will Israel recognize as a violation of the ceasefire agreement only actions so significant as a column of 1,000 Hezbollah fighters inbound to the border? Or will Israel take it as a provocation every time a rank-and-file Hezbollah fighter travels south of the Litani to visit their parents for dinner? And if Hezbollah fighters do maintain their day-to-day lives in the south rather than uprooting their families and leaving their lifelong communities, then how will Israel be confident that those same fighters aren't burrowing new tunnels under the border or slowly rearming the region in secret? Then there are the political realities that play around the ceasefire, both in Israel and in Lebanon. While in his post-agreement remarks, Prime Minister Netanyahu emphasized the devastation Israel had inflicted upon Hezbollah, claiming that the group was set back, quote, tens of years and was fundamentally changed by its ordeal, not everybody in Israel agrees. Northerners in particular are known to be upset with the deal, with key quotes collected by the BBC after the deal, calling it a, quote, irresponsible and hasty political decision, saying that the new status quo provided, quoting again, a real sense of unease and fright. It insisted that Israel hadn't gone far enough. Said one northern resident of the Lebanese villages just over the border, quote, The only thing I can hope for is that Hezbollah will not infiltrate these villages and build a new network. Apart from completely erasing these villages and having no people there, there is no real physical thing that can make me feel safe. In snap polling immediately after the ceasefire deal was reached, just 37% of Israelis expressed agreement with the peace terms, against 32% in opposition and 31% who said they didn't know either way. Among supporters of Netanyahu's own ruling coalition, just 20% were in support. One key member of that coalition, the ultranationalist leader and national security minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, cast the sole vote in opposition to the agreement within Israel's Security Council. It posts on X after the deal was agreed. Ben-Gvir claimed that the deal would fail to deter Hezbollah and that it, quote, in fact, will miss a historic opportunity to strike them hard and bring them to their knees. Ben-Gvir's support, and the support of other key leaders within Israel's far right, are a known pressure point for Prime Minister Netanyahu, whose ruling coalition would almost certainly collapse without their support. How their influence over the PM is exercised in the future around this issue, that remains to be seen. In Lebanon, meanwhile, the harsh reality is that a population devastated by months of ruinous airstrikes and sabotage attacks doesn't quickly forget what it's endured. In many communities, every person Israel killed in its campaign is now a martyr. Sectarian divisions have grown deeper, and anti-Israel sentiments have become more entrenched, and people who may never have been radicalized before are on the path toward radicalization now. The justifications for military action that made perfect sense in Israel are dismissed out of hand in communities just a few kilometers from the Israeli border. Those people, too, will place pressure on their leaders to act differently and may seek help from Hezbollah if their leaders prove incapable or unwilling to listen. And speaking of Hezbollah, the organization's surviving leaders have stated after the fact that while they'll treat the deal as if it's got potential, they're more than willing to return to combat if Israel begins a campaign of attacks into Lebanon again. And internationally, political upheaval within the nation Israel relies upon most of all, the United States, may spell trouble in the future. According to sources interviewed by American press, incoming President-elect Donald Trump's team has been briefed to the ceasefire efforts and found them generally agreeable. But in his second term, as in his first, Trump is expected to be a disruptive influence in global politics. What the implications of that could be, it's hard to know till we get there. In a sign that Team Trump may seek to uphold the deal, the president-elect's political advisors are working to frame the deal as a victory for their man. As Trump's incoming national security advisor put it, quoting him here, his resounding victory sent a clear message to the rest of the world that chaos won't be tolerated. I'm glad to see concrete steps towards de-escalation in the Middle East. Team Biden's response by way of his national security advisor was, quoting, I would just point out that you know you've done a really good thing when other people take credit for it. But the one fleeting hope that now appears quite unlikely to be realized is the hope that a ceasefire with Hezbollah would inspire Israel to pursue the same with Hamas in Gaza. Their war still rages as Israel draws increasing condemnation for what appears to be a policy to starve out civilians in Gaza's north in order to enable combat operations where all non-IDF forces are classified as combatants in a large clearing operation to root out what remains of Hamas there. Across the territory, hunger grows more profound and fears of imminent famine are rising again, a death toll that Gazan Hamas-affiliated administrations now count at well over 44,000 Palestinians. Those figures are partially, but not fully verified by outside humanitarian organizations, but despite the urgent need for a ceasefire to protect civilian life, both Israel and Hamas have indicated that no such ceasefire will be forthcoming. Hamas is expected to further entrench its positions now that its fellow militant group has abandoned its cause, while Netanyahu pledged to destroy Hamas and free all Israeli hostages in Gaza before the war ends up there. Neither side appears to have moderated its stance. Across the Israel-Lebanon border, it's a rare moment in global conflicts when all sides can claim at least a modicum of victory. Israel can claim the dismantling of Hezbollah. Hezbollah can claim the retreat of Israel. The United States and France can claim major diplomatic success, and the entire rest of the world can put at least one set of worries to the side for a little while, anyway. But there's still a tremendous amount of work left to ensure that this conflict is settled for the long term, and to move toward the possibly unachievable but undeniable worthy objective of peace in the Middle East more broadly. This ceasefire is just one step in that direction, but it's one more step than we usually get to talk about, and that, even by itself, is worth celebrating.